Adams' execution date was set, and the system moved forward without hesitation. But Adams refused to give up. He spent every waking hour writing letters to lawyers, reporters, and activists, pleading for someone to take a closer look at his case. Most of those letters were ignored. To the outside world, Adams was just another convicted cop killer. The courts had ruled, and few questioned the verdict. But inside his cell, Adams knew something that no one else seemed to care about. The real killer was still free. The Texas sun had long since dipped below the horizon, casting a dim glow over the highways of Dallas. It was November 27, 1976, just another Saturday night for most. But for Randall Dale Adams, it was the night that would alter the course of his life forever. Randall, a 27-year-old drifter from Ohio, had recently arrived in Texas looking for work. He had found a temporary job at an office supply company and was staying at a motel. His days were simple, filled with routine, and he had no run-ins with the law. But fate had other plans for him. That evening, Adams had been out looking for something to do when he encountered David Ray Harris, a 16-year-old Texan with a rebellious streak. Harris, driving a stolen blue Mercury Comet, had picked up Adams as he was walking along the road. The teenager seemed eager to show off his car, boasting about his adventures and the things he had done. He had a gun in the car, casually mentioning that he had stolen it, along with the vehicle, from his home in Vidor, Texas. As they drove around Dallas, Harris suggested they go to a drive-in movie. Adams, having nothing better to do, agreed. They spent a few hours watching a film, and then, as midnight approached, Harris drove Adams back to his motel. Adams thought nothing of the night. A ride from a friendly but reckless teenager, a movie, and a quiet return to his room. He had no idea that just a few hours later, the city would be rocked by a crime that would set the wheels of a tragic miscarriage of justice in motion. Not far from where Adams had been dropped off, a Dallas police officer, Robert W. Wood, was making his routine patrol. Wood, an officer known for his diligence, pulled over a suspicious vehicle in the dead of night. But before he could react, a gun was raised from the driver's side window, and multiple shots rang out. Officer Wood collapsed beside his patrol car, lifeless. His partner, Teresa Turco, could only watch in horror as the suspects sped away into the darkness. The search for the killer had begun, and Randall Dale Adams, a man who had simply accepted a ride that night, was about to find himself in the middle of a nightmare he never could have imagined. The streets of Dallas were eerily quiet the morning after Officer Robert W. Wood's murder. The police force was in a state of shock. One of their own had been gunned down in cold blood, and the killer was still out there. The pressure to solve the case was immense, and the Dallas Police Department was determined to find a suspect quickly. Officer Teresa Turco, the only eyewitness, had been riding alongside Wood that night. Though shaken, she managed to give a description of the suspect's car, a blue Mercury Comet. However, in the chaos of the shooting, she never saw the shooter's face. Leads were scarce, but soon, an anonymous tip led detectives to a name: David Ray Harris. Harris was no stranger to trouble. Just 16 years old, he had already stolen multiple cars and was known to carry weapons. When police brought him in for questioning, they found his behavior unsettling, cocky, arrogant, and eager to talk. To the detectives, Harris seemed a likely suspect. He had been driving a stolen blue Mercury Comet that night, and he had a history of reckless behavior. But rather than admit to anything, Harris did something unexpected. He pointed the finger at Randall Dale Adams. Harris told the police that he had picked up Adams the previous night, and that Adams was the one who pulled the trigger during the traffic stop. He claimed that Adams had taken his gun, fired the shots, and then forced Harris to drive away. It was a shocking accusation, but the detectives, desperate to close the case, latched onto it. They now had a suspect, one with no local ties, no strong alibi, and, most importantly, no one to defend him. But there was a problem. David Ray Harris had everything to lose if he admitted to the murder. At 16, he was still a juvenile and could escape the death penalty. If Adams, a 27-year-old drifter, was convicted instead, Harris would walk away free. The case against Randall Dale Adams had begun to take shape, and soon the police came knocking on his door. Adams was shocked when detectives arrived at his motel, asking him about the events of the previous night. He cooperated fully, explaining that he had spent time with Harris, but had returned to his room long before the murder occurred. But the detectives weren't interested in his story. They already had their suspect. They just needed him to confess. When Adams refused to say he was involved, the police pushed harder. They brought in witnesses, people who would later be revealed as unreliable, who claimed they had seen Adams that night near the crime scene. The pressure was mounting. The police, the prosecutors, and even the public wanted justice for Officer Wood. And in their rush to find the culprit, they ignored the most important question: what if they had the wrong man? As the case moved forward, Adams would soon find himself trapped in a legal battle where the truth no longer mattered. The Dallas Police Department had their suspect, Randall Dale Adams, and they were determined to convict him. But their case had a fatal flaw. There was no physical evidence linking Adams to the crime. The murder weapon? Never found. Fingerprints at the scene? None matched Adams. Eyewitness identification? Officer Teresa Turco, the only person who saw the crime, had not seen the shooter's face. Despite this, the prosecution needed a solid case to take to trial. And that's when things took a disturbing turn. After his arrest, Adams was subjected to relentless interrogations. Detectives pressured him to confess, using psychological tactics to wear him down. "You were there, Randall. We know you did it," they repeated. "Just tell us what happened and we can help you." But Adams refused. He knew he was innocent. He had no reason to confess to something he didn't do. Frustrated, the police turned to another method: fabricating evidence. The prosecution produced 3 key witnesses, people who claimed they saw Adams near the crime scene: Emily Miller and Michael Miller, a married couple who later admitted something shocking: Robert Balch, a man with a criminal history who suddenly remembered seeing Adams near the murder scene. Their testimonies didn't match up, and their credibility was questionable, but the prosecution didn't care. They needed a conviction, and Adams was the perfect scapegoat. Meanwhile, David Ray Harris, the actual killer, watched from a distance as his story was believed without question. He had everything to gain. He was just a teenager. If caught, he would face a lesser sentence. He had a history of lying and violence, but authorities ignored it. He was the one driving the stolen Mercury Comet, yet no one pressed him on this detail. Harris's strategy worked. The police never seriously investigated him as a suspect. He had successfully shifted all blame onto Adams. By the time Adams's case went to trial in 1977, the media had already painted him as a cop killer. The courtroom was filled with tension, as Officer Wood's family, fellow officers, and prosecutors all demanded justice. But justice was the last thing Adams was about to receive. The prosecution, led by Douglas Mulder, painted Adams as a violent drifter who had every reason to kill a police officer. He waved the unreliable witnesses before the jury as proof. And then, in a move that would later be exposed as corrupt, the prosecution hid crucial evidence, statements that contradicted the witnesses' testimony. Adams sat in the courtroom, realizing that his fate was being decided not by truth, but by deception. The jury didn't take long to deliberate, and when they returned, the verdict was devastating. Guilty. Randall Dale Adams was sentenced to death. As he was led out of the courtroom, the weight of the moment hit him. He was an innocent man, and he was going to die for a crime he didn't commit. The cold walls of Texas death row were unlike anything Randall Dale Adams had ever imagined. The moment the verdict was read, guilty, sentenced to death, his world shrank to a 6-by-9-foot cell. The hum of fluorescent lights, the distant echoes of guards' boots, and the haunting whispers of other condemned men became his reality. Adams, who had never imagined himself a criminal, now sat among Texas's most dangerous offenders. The air was thick with desperation. Some men clung to appeals, others counted down the days to their execution. The state of Texas was known for swift executions. Adams' execution date was set, and the system moved forward without hesitation. But Adams refused to give up. He spent every waking hour writing letters to lawyers, reporters, and activists, pleading for someone to take a closer look at his case. Most of those letters were ignored. To the outside world, Adams was just another convicted cop killer. The courts had ruled, and few questioned the verdict. But inside his cell, Adams knew something that no one else seemed to care about. The real killer was still free. While Adams rotted away in a prison cell, David Ray Harris was out living his life. Harris, the actual murderer, had faced no consequences. His testimony against Adams had allowed him to walk away completely free. Instead of turning his life around, Harris continued down a violent path. He bragged to friends about getting away with murder, laughing about how he had let an innocent man take his place, and yet the justice system didn't question him. No one was watching Harris. Adams's execution loomed closer, but then, by a stroke of fate, his death sentence was commuted to life in prison. The reason? A Supreme Court ruling had changed the requirements for capital punishment cases, and Adams's trial had technical flaws. The state still considered him guilty, but he was no longer scheduled for execution. It wasn't justice, but it was time. Time Adams desperately needed to fight for the truth. For years, Adams's pleas had gone unheard. But in the early 1980s, his case caught the attention of a young filmmaker named Errol Morris. Morris, originally working on a documentary about Texas's criminal justice system, stumbled upon Adams's case and was immediately suspicious. The trial didn't add up. The evidence was weak, the witnesses were unreliable, and most importantly, David Ray Harris was acting guilty. Morris knew there was a bigger story here. He began digging through old court transcripts, conducting interviews, and tracking down Harris himself. What Morris was about to uncover would shock the world. By the mid-1980s, Randall Dale Adams had spent nearly a decade in prison for a crime he didn't commit. His pleas for help had largely gone unanswered, until filmmaker Errol Morris began investigating his case. At first, Morris had no intention of focusing on Adams. He had traveled to Texas to research the criminal justice system and death row cases. But as he interviewed lawyers, police officers, and former inmates, he kept hearing about Adams. Something about the case didn't sit right. Morris began digging deep. He went through old trial transcripts, rewatched interviews, and tracked down witnesses who had testified against Adams. What he found was shocking. The key witnesses who claimed they saw Adams had been pressured by police. Officer Teresa Turco, the surviving officer, had never identified Adams as the shooter. The prosecution had hidden evidence that contradicted their own case. But the biggest revelation came when Morris tracked down David Ray Harris, the teenager whose testimony had sent Adams to death row. Morris met with Harris, now an adult, in a Texas prison where he was serving time for another violent crime. What started as an interview turned into an unexpected confession. Harris, speaking with chilling arrogance, admitted that Adams had nothing to do with the murder. "He's not the one who pulled the trigger," Harris said. "Then who did?" Morris pressed. Harris smirked. "Well, it sure wasn't Randall Dale Adams." It was as close to an admission as anyone could get, and Morris had it all on tape. Morris took his findings and turned them into a documentary, The Thin Blue Line, 1988. The film didn't just suggest Adams was innocent, it proved it. Using real footage, reenactments, and interviews, the film exposed the corruption and manipulation that led to Adams's wrongful conviction. The documentary went viral for its time, gaining national attention. For the first time in over a decade, people were listening. Lawyers, activists, and journalists began questioning the case. Public pressure mounted, and finally, after years of being ignored, the legal system was forced to take a second look. With the overwhelming evidence from the documentary, Adams's legal team fought for a retrial. In 1989, after 12 years in prison, Adams' conviction was overturned. He walked out of prison a free man. For the first time in over a decade, he could breathe fresh air as an innocent man. But there was one final question left unanswered. Would David Ray Harris finally face justice? As Randall Dale Adams took his first steps outside of prison in 1989, the world had changed. The streets of Dallas were no longer familiar. The world had moved on, but for Adams, time had stood still. He had spent 12 years behind bars for a crime he didn't commit. And now, despite being free, his life was in ruins. He had no job. He had no money. He had no home. The state of Texas offered him nothing. No compensation, no apology, no support. They had stolen over a decade of his life, and now they wanted to forget about him. But Adams couldn't forget. Not yet. Because the real killer, David Ray Harris, was still out there. After successfully framing Adams for the murder of Officer Wood, Harris had spent his teen years bragging about getting away with it. But he didn't stop there. By the late 1980s, Harris had been arrested multiple times for assault, robbery, and other violent crimes. His recklessness had finally caught up with him. He was serving time in prison when Errol Morris confronted him in 1988 and got the confession that freed Adams. But would Texas now prosecute Harris for the murder? Adams, now free, hoped authorities would finally go after Harris, but the justice system refused. The statute of limitations on perjury had expired, meaning Harris couldn't be charged for lying in court. The original case had been so corrupt that evidence had been destroyed, lost, or buried. Prosecutors didn't want to admit they had made a mistake in convicting Adams. Once again, David Ray Harris walked free. For a while, Harris continued his pattern of crime. But in 2004, his luck finally ran out. Now 47 years old, Harris had gotten into an argument with a neighbor over a woman in Beaumont, Texas. Fueled by rage, he shot and killed the man in cold blood. This time, there was no scapegoat, no Randall Dale Adams to take the fall. Harris was arrested, tried, and sentenced to death. On June 30, 2004, in Huntsville, Texas, David Ray Harris was executed. In his final moments, reporters asked him if he had anything to say. Would he finally confess? Would he finally admit that he framed an innocent man? Harris only smiled. And then, without a word, he was put to death. The same fate Adams had barely escaped decades earlier. Randall Dale Adams spent the rest of his life trying to rebuild, but the scars of wrongful conviction never left him. He sued the state of Texas but was denied compensation. He spoke at universities, warning about flaws in the justice system. He remained haunted by what had been stolen from him. On October 30, 2010, Adams passed away at the age of 61. Though he had won his freedom, justice had come too late.